when we're looking at the roadmap or the plans for IT, when we're looking at the direction we want to go, we really start at with the very basics. So kind of keeping the lights on, as you mentioned, designing the organization's IT infrastructure. I was talking to a customer the other day about the processes that they were implementing, and I think there was some confusion about one of the most basic processes, incident management. And we were kind of got into this whole discussion about how they're handling it, and what it came down to was essentially that regardless of what you call the process, there are certain key components or certain key functions of the IT organization that are really not negotiable. I mean, there are certain things you've got to fix things when they break. That's what it came down to. Whether you call it incident management or not, that's one of your basic requirements as an IT organization. But to really go beyond that and beyond just the simple break-fix type of service desk or service that you're providing to your customers, you want to build on that. You've got to increasingly make sure that sensitive financial and legal data is protected. And so we'll talk a little bit about design consideration when it comes to those areas. Beyond that, you want to save the organization money when possible. So looking at IT as a cost center as opposed to a value center, you really want to reverse that trend and be able to negotiate effectively with your suppliers. So supplier management has really gained a lot more traction, especially when you're dealing with ever smaller budgets. And then finally, the last step here, as I've outlined, is to really become a strategic partner with the business. So fully integrated, not just aligned with the business, but fully integrated into the business. And you want the head of IT to have a seat at the table when important business decisions are made, not to have the organization going off and making agreements or purchasing equipment and software without the input and even without the approval of IT. So you really want to maximize the value that IT brings to the whole organization. So in order to do that, it's helpful for organizations to adopt structure, to adopt governance. We mentioned ISO earlier on. ISO is very prescriptive and has a set path to becoming certified. ITIL, which is what we're going to focus on today, is a little bit different in that it's a framework and it can be adapted and adopted by organizations of any size. It was originally developed, to give you a little bit of background, in the mid-'80s. And at the time, though, it was developed by a government organization in the UK, and it was very function-based. So there were 40 different books, all covering a different function. Still a little bit too siloed. As the practice grew and as the framework grew, in '99 they released version 2. So originally it actually wasn't called version 1, it was just called ITIL. Now then they came out with a version 2. They focused more in version 2 on processes. They split it into just 2 books, service support and service delivery, made it a lot more manageable. A lot of the same processes were covered, but just more focus was put on how the processes interrelate. Finally, in 2007, version 3 was released, and subsequent to that, there has also been a 2011 version, which is just a modification of some of the text in the version 3 book. So it's not listed as a full, it's kind of like a point release, I guess you could call it, as opposed to a full version release. But with version 3, it now becomes this full service lifecycle based practice. And there are very distinct relationships here between and among the various lifecycle phases. So we start with service strategy, we move on to design, transition, operation, and then surrounding all of that is continual service improvement. So it incorporates the teachings from the first two versions, but it really builds on that to become to show how this works through the whole life cycle. Before I get into the specifics of actual service strategy, I do want to look at the individual phases and also some of the basic terminology. So in looking at the phases I mentioned, we start with service strategy. And one thing that I think is important to understand is how you go from one phase to the next. And it's not always linear. Sometimes you start in the middle. There is still the concept of continual service improvement for each of the phases. When you start with service strategy, you develop a strategy or direction, and an output of the service strategy phase should be your service requirements. The service requirements then get handed off to service design. In the service design phase, you then develop and have as an output a service design package. The design gets handed off to transition. Transition is where you make it real and you transition what has been designed into the live environment. And so the output of service transition would be a service release package. The release goes into operation, so in your service operation phase of the life cycle. And as most of you all know, if you work in IT, typically the output of operations are reports, lots and lots of reports, different types of reports that measure the success or the improvement of the processes within service operation. Those reports then get fed into continual service improvement, where you can compare to baselines and take corrective action as needed to start the cycle all over again. Notice also this yellow circle that surrounds the service life cycle, the complementary guidance. So when you're talking strictly about the actual publications, and these do come as books still, although I think it's usually most convenient for people to purchase these as digital editions. That often comes in handy, that digital editions that you can search. But with the complementary guidance, all that means is that there is a whole field of study and additional titles that have been published in support of the ITIL life cycle. So for example, there are specific publications just for building a service catalog or ITIL for small business. And those can be very helpful in your efforts as well. So I mentioned I also wanted to touch on some of the terminology. And it's, I think, going back to when I used to train the ITIL Foundation classes, and this is still, I think, one of the biggest points of value in attending ITIL training, is that you get to speak the same language with others within your organization. So I've had a number of organizations that really, maybe some of the attendees weren't quite as enthusiastic about the class, but regardless of that, I found that afterwards they started speaking the same language, talking about the processes, and were able to more easily relate, especially when you're talking between groups. So, maybe the service desk talking to somebody in the desktop support group. They were able to more easily relate and measure the success of what they were doing because they were all speaking the same language. One of the things that came up with version 3 of ITIL was this idea of good practices. Letting IT organizations know that, yeah, it is important to understand what best practices are, but focus really on adopting some of these good practices before you get to best. So almost like the saying that perfection is the enemy of good. Let's strive for being good before we go over the next hurdle to get to best. There's the concepts here of utility and warranty. These are very important concepts, especially for the service strategy phase. When we're developing a strategy or deciding what services do we want to deploy for our organization, we have to understand and make sure that they are providing sufficient levels of utility and warranty to satisfy the needs of the business. Utility would be the feature set. Is it capable of doing what we want it to do? Warranty is, if you think of the warranty on a vehicle, is it reliable enough and stable enough to do what we need it to do on a regular basis? Some other concepts here, capabilities and resources. So we need to have a good understanding in ITIL, especially as IT managers. We need to understand what the capabilities and resources are of our IT organization. We need to understand resources is a little bit easier to understand. It's the physical or tangible assets that we have. It's the equipment, the infrastructure, the people, the bodies, basically. The capabilities, on the other hand, are the skill sets. So of those people that we have working on our IT team, what skill sets do they possess? And you need to have a good understanding of that in order to know and understand whether you are able to provide the services to your organization or whether perhaps some of those capabilities and resources need to be outsourced. Do you need to bring in external or third-party vendors in order to assist? Do you need perhaps, or is there a focus on cloud first, where you have, instead of having the physical resources and infrastructure, that you have it hosted? Another term that we discuss a lot is the service catalog, and understanding how we maintain a list of the services that are in the live or operational environment within the organization, and how we then share that with the organization, not just with IT, but also with the business, and help them understand exactly what it is that IT does and what services we provide. The final one here is just I guess maybe a personal favorite of mine, but I think it is helpful to understand, especially if you continue to attend these webinars. When we talk about continual service improvement, which is the final webinar, this is where the Deming cycle really comes into play. But I think it's important to understand it up front that in the Deming cycle, and you can look it up to find out more background on how this all came to be, but there's this concept of, it's also called the PDCA, or Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. Idea here is that you make plans. So again, what we're starting with here today and talking about strategy and design. You do the work, or you do the implementation. You check, meaning you run reports, you validate, measure what it is that you've implemented or the service that you're providing. And then you act, meaning you take corrective action as needed to improve the service continually. I will also touch briefly on roles and talking about what roles there are within the ITIL framework. The important point here, I think, is the last one. Roles don't necessarily equal job descriptions. So especially in smaller organizations, some individuals probably will be performing one or more roles. For larger organizations, one role may be shared by several people. The two different types of roles, and I think this can be illustrated a little bit better on the next slide, are the service owners and process owners.